So today we are continuing the series, Wisdom Begins in Wonder. And the wisdom we're seeking after is God's wisdom. And that comes to us as we work through, as we work towards second half living. Now, second half living is not analogous to the Chiefs football playing. I think we'd all just assume they would do more in the first half than they do in the second half. But that's neither here nor there. But it is to say that our lives can be divided up into two halves. And we have to go from the first half into the second half. The first half, Father Richard Rohr in his book Falling Upwards calls it the container. And like any container, it holds stuff in. It gives something a shape, and some of them even do a good job of keeping things level or directing things off into the right parts of the container that they're supposed to be. It holds things together and gives them what they need so that they can serve their purpose. And there are many things in life that we can describe as we go throughout our lives that will serve that same type of purpose for us, but we're going to take what Paul is talking about in Romans chapter 7, and we're going to use that as our container because it is the most fitting for us. And Paul, in chapter 7, is talking about the law. And in fact, if you look at that, it probably is the most frequent word used in chapter 7 because he belabors that point all the way throughout. Not even just the part of chapter 7 that we read for today, but through the entire chapter, he's doing that. And he's doing that because he's drawing out a much bigger point. For the Jews of his time, and really for any end time, he is describing the function of the law. Now go all the way back to the book of Exodus when they received that. When they received the law, they were in the wilderness, and they were in the wilderness for good reason. Not just because they had sinned, and this was kind of their punishment. That was almost an ancillary thing for that. What was most important about what they were doing, remember, is that they were being formed as a nation and as a people. Remember, they had come out of Egypt. They had no idea how to be one people together because the Egyptians had been over them. And so the law, as it was given to them, and in the wilderness, so that they could have the time they needed to be formed and shaped by that law into that people. It's the container that holds them together. It's what takes them from slaves in Egypt and shapes them into the nation that will cross over into the promised land. And so this is what Paul is building on. In verse 7, he makes the comment, though, he says, I wouldn't have known sin except through the law, which is a true statement. But in verse 12, he also says, so the law itself is holy, and the commandment is holy, righteous, and good. The law is holy, it is righteous, it is good. But that gets tempered as Paul puts all of this together. Then in verse 14, he makes this comment. He says, we know that the law is spiritual. He says, but I'm made of flesh and blood, and I'm sold as a slave to sin. For all that the law, the commandments, the words of the prophets tell us, and how they form us and shape us, there is a limit to what they can do also. So that's part of that we have to keep in mind. So what do we mean by all of this? I'm going to use a couple of examples this morning that are, one is a little bit silly, the other is not quite so silly and more pertinent maybe. But the silly example is this. It's what Emily and I are doing with Jack right now, and that is that we're working on potty training. Right? Told you it was kind of silly. Now as a side note, this is maybe, Beth, you can tell me more about this, but I think I need to start a jar that I put $1 into every time I use Jack in a sermon. Maybe by the time he's 18, I'll have his college paid for, because that's kind of how this is going to go, I think. But one of the things we're doing is that every time he tells us that he has to go potty, he gets a sticker. Now what that really means right now is, because he's not quite made all the connections in there, is that he's already gone and what he needs is a diaper change, but he's recognizing part of that, and so we give him a sticker and he puts it on a sticker chart, and when he fills that sticker chart up, he's going to get something special. He's not in here right now, so I can say we have no idea what that special thing is going to be yet, but we've still got a ways to go before we get there. And as silly as that sounds, that is a law, or it's a container. It is something that is forming and shaping Jack into the big kid that he is going to become. Now, out of the sillier realm of things, we can take a look at some broad strokes, what we see happening as an example in the books of Luke and Acts. They're written by the same person. They're written by Luke, and they give us this thing that is happening. And you can take it when you read them together. You can see as Luke starts big and brings things down. First, throughout the Gospel of Luke, it starts big, brings it down to Jesus, and then Jerusalem, and then to the cross. And then after the cross, we expand out from there throughout the end of the book of Acts. That is almost by design for how Luke wrote those, is to make that shift and make that pivot. So we have in Luke can be described as the container, it's the forming and the shaping, and Acts then is what comes after. We take a look at Luke there. It is the container. It's where Jesus is doing the forming and the shaping of the disciples. His teachings are taking on the function of the law as he is giving them new shape and new form and new identity. Taking them from where they were and molding them into something new. But as with all things, there's a limit to what the law can do. There's a natural limit for it. And this is one of the main points that Paul is driving home in Romans chapter 7, is that the law does not get us all the way there. It has a limit. Only so much that it can do. One of the most important things to note is that the law only works because folks agreed to abide by the law. Paul points this out when he says, before I knew what the law was, I was without sin. Because he didn't know what it was. If you don't know what it is and you don't agree to abide by it, it has no power over you. And so there's one of the parts of it, but also Paul points out in chapter 7, verse 1, he says, don't you know that the law has power over someone only as long as he or she lives? Right? There's a limit to what the law can do, a limit to how far it can go. Which means that the law is inherently self-centered. And that's not a bad thing, it's just descriptive. And it has to be, because like any good container, you put something into it, it gets contained. In that container, it doesn't matter how big the container is that you are trying to fill up, even if it is, like Jack says, big giant, it still has to stay fairly close to what it is holding to keep it there. And as it keeps it there, and as you put more stuff in there to fill it up, it becomes more contained and becomes more shaped by the container that it's a part of, and it becomes more focused in on itself. That is the function of a container, and that is what the law is doing. It is inherently self-centered out of necessity. But because the container then is doing that work, it can only go so far, which means it can't go any farther than that. There is a limit to where it can go. Go back to the silly example. When Jack is potty training, we are focused on him. Again, out of necessity. Because if you have ever taken a kid through potty training, you know all you need is one moment of inattention, right? And then what are you doing? Cleaning. A lot of cleaning. Because that's just what happens. There's a limit to that, though. Once he learns how to do that, I'm not going to have to reteach him how to do that, right? Now, I was a boy at one time, and I've heard stories of raising boys, so I know that at some point there's going to be some fine-tuning that's going to have to happen. But that's okay. It's still a different thing. It doesn't matter. Once he reaches that age, there aren't many stickers he's going to be excited for. So things will be different. But at this point in his life, it's what works. It's what's forming him and shaping him to become a big kid. In a not at all related but similar fashion, this is what Jesus is doing. He is shaping the disciples. But he knows that there is an end to that shaping that he's going to do. And so he is incredibly focused on them and teaching them, making sure that they are getting it. But what makes him a little bit different is that while he is focused on them, he is also focused on getting them to Jerusalem. Jerusalem, because it is the very center of Jewish life. And so everything is going to come together there in Jerusalem. But remember, there's a limit to how far that it can go, how far the law can go. There's a limit to what Jesus is doing in his teaching. Jesus is getting them to Jerusalem because he has to destroy that extreme limit of the law. That extreme limit is, as Paul describes it, the wages of sin. And the wages of sin, he says, is death. And Paul spends time reminding us that what the law does is tell us what is broken. It may even tell us the how or the why that something is broken, and it even sometimes does a decent job of giving us a way out of that if it can. But the law is not primarily constructive at all. It is descriptive. That is ultimately its function. Paul can use the law to describe why he continues to do the things that he hates and not do the things that he wants to do, because the law tells him that's what he's doing. That's Romans 7 verses 15 and 16. But what the law can't do is show him what comes next. What comes after you go beyond the capacity of the law. Eventually, Jack will be done with potty training, and I'm looking forward to that day when we don't have to buy diapers anymore. What's easy with kids, if anything can ever be described as being easy with kids, is that there's always something else to move on to. You finish one thing and you no more get that one thing done, and you probably started 3 others that you're working on at that point, right? That's just the way it goes. So we can sometimes miss the things that are happening. We can miss when we have reached the extent of what something can do. We can sometimes continue to try and to apply that same thing we've been doing long after it's been effective, and the capacity of that container has been, is spilling over, right? There's only so much milk I can put into a bottle before it will start to flow over, right? Again, that moment of inattention can sometimes get to you a little bit. And we don't always think about what comes up next. Or we don't think about the thing that we're leaving behind. But we look to what Jesus is doing. Jesus is showing us the ultimate failure of the law. Now, failure is not a bad thing here. It's just descriptive. It's just that life will always exceed the limits of what the law can do. But sometimes we can lose sight of just where those limits of the law are. And we can continue to try and force it continue to force it to work beyond what it is capable of doing. In Jerusalem on Good Friday and into Easter, Jesus shows us the limits of the law. We're drawn in that moment to the very most center point of life. Not just Jewish life centered on the temple, but all creation centered on the cross. And where do you go after that? Remember that the law forms us and shapes us. That's its point. But there's a limit to what it can do. And that limit comes because in order to be formed and shaped by that, we have to be focused on ourselves. And mostly the law is just descriptive. It doesn't build anything, but it shows us where things are broken. And that's the limit of the container. That's the limit of first half thinking and living. But that is a necessary journey that we have to take. The Israelites couldn't have gotten into the promised land without wandering around in the wilderness first. They weren't ready for it. They hadn't been shaped and formed so that they can make that transition. Jack can't really go on to anything else until he is potty trained. I mean, he can, it just gets complicated after that. It makes life easier. Jesus, at the center of all of that, brings all of this together. All of creation becomes focused on that one point of Jesus on the cross. That moment is the most self-centered moment in all of human history. Everything, all of creation becomes focused on that moment of Jesus on the cross. And when you can't go any farther in than that, and you can't be contained any farther in than that, where do you go after all that? You go out. You have to go out. You have to go out where there are no limits. But when you go out, you go having been shaped and formed by what it is that has come before you. But you are not limited now by that. What that means for us is next week. That's where we're going next week. What does it mean to live in the second half? Having been formed and shaped by that, but no longer limited by what has come before. For now, here's our task. For now, our task is to look at the world with new eyes, to look where we are being formed and shaped by so many things that are around us, and to look for the limits that are inherently a part of all of those things. And then to begin to look with new eyes and ask the question, where do we go from here? We do this all in the name of the one who took us to the very most self-centered point in all of human history, in all of creation, and then said to us, now go out into all the world. Let us go out in the name of the one who came and showed us how to go beyond those limits and to see the world in a new way. Let us do this in the name of the one who was there on the cross, in the name of the one who is still at work in our lives now. Let us do all of this in Christ's name. Amen.